Thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. Hi, Alice. Over to you.
Thank you, Christina. Absolutely my privilege to be here today, and I'm really delighted to see so many people on the call. I would just want to say a few words really about the overall context. So where are we at IMechE? Well, we've just launched our high-level strategy. We're really, really excited about that. And one of the things it does is sets the vision for who we are or who we want to be. And that is a global, inclusive, and digitally enabled community of engineers. And I hope you will realise, that means inclusion is really, really hardwired into our strategy going forwards. It's also one of our 4 values, along with integrity, impact, and innovation. And I hope that won't be surprising to many people around this table. And I hope most people around this table understand why inclusion is so important. And quite simply, it's because so many of the global challenges that are facing, humankind at the moment will only be resolved through the application of engineering solutions. We talk a lot about this in the context of things like climate change and sustainability, our transition to a just net zero future. All of this has engineering absolutely at its heart. We need everyone around the table, right? We need all the minds around the table. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joining this first call with our first in a number of partnerships that we hope to realise to engage with and uplift. It's a really important word, our underrepresented communities, because the unfortunate truth is the barriers are still there for our underrepresented communities. And the first thing, as Christina put so well at the beginning of this seminar, is that we take the time to listen and to understand. So delighted that there's so many people around the table. One of the things that we really, really are encouraging is allyship. One of the very tangible opportunities in this new partnership between IMechE and the Association for Black and Ethnic Minority Engineers is that we hope to cooperate on a mentorship programme. That means opportunities on both sides. It means opportunities for mentees and mentors. So that's really just a little bit of scene setting for me. I won't hold the floor any longer, but it does give me absolute delight to be able to introduce Ollie Folayan MBE, who is the co-founder of the Association of Black and Ethnic Minority Engineers. He is also the visiting professor at the School of Science and Engineering at the University of Dundee and the head of process and safety at the engineering consultancy Optimus Plus Aberdeen. So without any further words from me, I hand over the floor to you, Ollie. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Alice. And it's a pleasure to meet you and pleasure to be with everyone. How's everyone doing today? Would you like to just give me a reaction by your emoji? Just tell me, are you feeling really, really happy? Are you feeling a bit down, or are you just feeling, as young people say, meh? You can tell me in the chat. So okay, I can see Alice is definitely feeling happy. Any other thoughts? Here's another test for you, and I've been looking for the right sort of weird and wonderful. Oh, Mark Weaver's not feeling that happy. Sorry to hear that. I hope that what we share today is a little bit more cheerful and uplifting, even if we're talking about a challenging topic. I've been asking this question for the last few years. I've been asking people, if you could summarize the last 3 years, we've all been through a very interesting time. Oh, happy, okay. If you could summarize the last 3 years in one word, what would that word be? Now, there's only one rule in this game. You can't say unprecedented because everyone says that. So you got to think about something else. I'm looking for roller coaster. I agree. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? I'm just going to be sharing my screen in the meantime. Oh, wow. Mark may have come up with the most original I've seen so far. Opportunistic, phenomenal, transformative, unpredictable, chaotic. I couldn't agree more. One of the amazing things that's happened in the last few years is if anyone had told you in 2019 that there will come a time when we'll all be at home and we'll all go out with masks, I would probably have said I like some of what you're having because I thought this is probably unlikely. But that's what's happened. One of the other things that's happened is there's been a renewed emphasis and a renewed understanding of this issue around race and ethnicity following the very sad and tragic events that happened in May 2020. Now, when we started to have those conversations, I was thrilled to hear people finally sort of having these conversations as openly as they were. But what started to occur to me is that sometimes for people who don't necessarily have the lived experience of something, it can be very difficult to know when it's happening beyond that which is overt. And so that is the reason why we've put this together. It's to help foster a better understanding of racism. So I will start by sort of telling you a little bit about myself, talking about the journey to AFBE, and then we'll talk about racism, what it looks like today. We'll look at it through the lens of history, and after articulating the problem, we'll talk about allyship, talk about what we do as individuals, what we do as organizations, and I'll hopefully leave you with a few tips of things you can do, some of which you're already doing actually, just listening to what Alice was saying earlier. So I am a process engineer. I lead a team of, as I usually say, Aberdeen's best consultancy. I have to say that. And we work on everything from, solving problems on oil and gas platforms to working on some new technologies, such as carbon capture, plastics to hydrogen, and so many exciting projects. I was 9 years old when I decided I wanted to be a chemical engineer. Sorry to all mechanical engineers. My dad was a mechanical engineer. And it wasn't because I didn't choose engineering because I was brought up in that environment. Actually, my inspiration came from a much darker source. See, when I was 9, I read a book, and in that book, there was an evil genius who could use chemicals and solar energy to do lots of horrible things. And as a good 9-year-old Christian boy, I've read about all those horrible things, and I thought that's who I want to be like when I grow up. My values are different now, you'd be pleased to know. But that interest in the way things work and interest in engineering kind of led me down a path where I ended up at the University of Sheffield. I did a degree in chemical engineering and fuel technology, and then went on to do a PhD in combustion, and then started my job. And I've been working now for more than 20 years on various kinds of projects. And the thing that I enjoy about being an engineer is that, one, you never feel like you exhaust what there is to learn. I feel like we've got the solution and we've got the approach for solving pretty much all problems. And the moment, while scientists might help us to understand the problem, the moment you get to a point where you have to think about solution, you have to contact an engineer. I like the fact that you can take a concept from a very kind of conceptual, you can take an idea from a very sort of fundamental stage, you can build it up, you can build, you can do a sort of front-end engineering design, do a detailed design, and then you get to a point where you actually commission. And almost always you you encounter some problems, some part of the theory that doesn't seem to match what's happening. And that's where it gets really exciting, because you surround yourself with a multidisciplinary team, and that moment where you kind of work out together, almost do detective work, and you find out what the problem is and solve it. That's one of the best feelings, being an engineer. But and I've had that pretty much my whole career. But some of the challenges that sort of brought me here and brought me to what I'm doing now with AFBE also started around that time. So I remember getting into my job, my very first job, and some of those challenges began on the first day. I remember having a chat then with my then boss, who wanted to know a bit about my family. I said my dad was a mechanical engineer who worked as an academic and was going into industry. And when I mentioned that he'd gone from industry back to academia, this man said, well, failed engineers teach. I remember thinking at the time, that's a bit odd. but not thinking too much more of it. But by day 2, I was being told that your PhD is not worth the paper that it's written on, and that was not a reaction to performance. It was day 2. But that just set the tone for the next 2.5 years, where I would constantly encounter a lot of sort of bullying in the workplace. So much so that people would often come to me, are you constantly being treated in that way? And, some of the reactions sort of ranged from, the simple, to just things that would come up in casual conversation. I remember when my nephew was born, as was the practice, I posted a picture of my nephew as on my computer wall screen. And my boss at the time would come over to my desk and he would say, he would look at that picture and he would go, "That's an ugly baby. That's an ugly baby." And he constantly just went on for weeks until I felt pressured to take it off. There were days when we would complete pieces of work and I would be told, well, that work could have been completed without you. And all of this started to take a toll just on me, not just on my mental health, but it triggered some physical illness that I still deal with today. But I remember at the time not wanting to associate anything to do with race with it. And the reason is that I constantly heard of people who constantly use race as a way of explaining away poor performance. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be like one of those people. And so for a long time, I didn't really think of it as a racial thing. But then I started to come across other people from similar backgrounds who were also having similar experiences. And also at the time, I was living in Croydon at the time, and there was a lot in the news, particularly around youth violence affecting young Black boys. So it was really a desire for me to find the kind of support network that I couldn't find in my company, and to then use that group of people to reach the community and reach young people within our community. It was those two thoughts that led my sister, Ollie Folayan, and myself to found the AFBE in 2007. And we started then with just 5 members. We now have 2,500 members across the UK. And the main statistic that drives what we do is the fact that only 9% of the engineering workforce is from a Black and minority ethnic background. In addition to that work that we do in terms of trying to attract more people into the sector, trying to retain talent and trying to raise leaders, we also work with more than 80 different corporations on their diversity and inclusion strategy. And it's been a pleasure to have the IMechE as one of those partners. Now, here is a picture of the great John Barnes, a Liverpool legend. And as you can see in this picture, he is backheeling a banana that was thrown at him from the pitch during a game against Everton in 1988. Now, John Barnes once appeared on an episode of Piers Morgan's Life Stories on ITV. Kate Garraway sat in for Piers Morgan, and I remember that Kate Garraway showed John Barnes this picture. And she said, "How did you feel when this happened?" And John Barnes's response was quite surprising. He said, "Well, it was a little inconvenient." He said, "But this is something that happens." Oh, sorry. I think there's somebody. Yeah, so John Barnes' response was quite surprising. He said, "It's a little inconvenient." He said, "But I live a life of privilege because I'm a footballer. And so there is this short window where I play football where I'm likely to encounter something like this." But then he said that there are invisible banana skins thrown at Black people every day. And if I could give you the alternative title of this presentation, it would be about those invisible banana skins. How do we find them? What do we do about them? So here's my second test. My first test was just kind of looking for a word. Can anyone tell me who this is? As I usually say, just in case the former Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, happened to make it into the AFBE talk today, I'd like to point out that this is not Marcus Rashford. Just saying. But does anyone know who this is? Any clues? I'm going to give you a clue. He's Italian. Any thoughts? Looks like we've got nothing at the moment. Now, here's a man called Alessandro de' Medici, who was the first Duke of Florence and head of the powerful Medici family. He was a person who was the product of an illegitimate union, and it was a certain set of circumstances that resulted in him becoming Duke. His mum was part African, a freed slave, and there are many books that look into Alessandro de' Medici and actually point out not just to the fact that he did have that background, but also points to the fact that he did have features actually that marked him out. Now, the story is told that one day, as Alessandro rode into Rome, he had been accused by some exiled Florentines and was about to meet with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. He couldn't help noticing some fresh welcoming graffiti scrawled on the walls of the city. And the graffiti said, "Hail Alessandro of Colle Vecchio." Now, when you hear the word hail, as in H-A-I-L, you would assume that he was being praised. But actually, that was meant as an insult, because Colle Vecchio was the birthplace of Alessandro's mother. And so, as I mentioned, Alessandro was a product of an illegitimate union. His mum was part African. So at that moment, the worst possible insult that could be leveled at Alessandro pertained to the circumstances of his birth. The idea of his skin tone or features doesn't even come up. And this was in 1535. Now, this is a portrait of Alessandro at that time, and most of you would agree, I'm sure, that it looks quite regal. When the same portrait is then described in 1875 in the Victorian era, different words are ascribed to the same portrait. He's described as having all the known features of the delinquent, amoral, constitutional type: proud, arrogant, selfish, sensual, a born criminal, are all used to describe this portrait. And this is because between that time, there came to be a difference in perception of skin tones, and race as we know it today became a thing. So let's define racism. Racism, as I think of it, is discrimination from a place of privilege or power. The idea of privilege or power is very important in the definition of racism. So to use an analogy, if a number of aliens suddenly landed in London, maybe in the IMechE headquarters, and declare on their arrival that anyone who doesn't have green skin, I don't know if they have green skin or not, is inferior, I may listen to that and I might go home, but the worst that would happen would be I'd go home with a bruised ego. But if that group of aliens suddenly decided that they are going to control your access to housing, to jobs, to opportunities, to the things that you need in order to live life, that declaration of superiority suddenly takes on a new significance. Racism operates like a virus that mutates with time. The new mutant form never completely replaces the parent. And quite often we can look at the parent, and by the parent I'm referring to those overt expressions of racism, and we can say, that's real racism. But the truth is, it is just a mutated form. And what we need to learn as allies is the ability to identify when racism is happening beyond that which is overt. I particularly like this description from John Foster Pedley of Henley Business School, Africa. He says, racism is a silent virus in the software of our minds, whose primary symptom is the capacity to fool its host that it isn't there. And we see that in the history of racism. If I asked everyone on this call, how long do you think we've had racism? Most people would assume that as soon as people of different ethnicities started to come together, we started to see racism. But that isn't true. Racism as we know it today, and by which I'm referring to an order of the world by phenotype, is about 500 years old and has had three key mutations in that time. You've had the religious, the scientific, and the cultural. The root of modern racism comes from this proto-racial idea of purity of blood that was articulated after the Reconquista in Spain as a way of making a distinction between real Christians and the Morisco Muslims and Marranos Jews of Spain. They brought into place a tiered citizenship, and the Moriscos and Marranos were eventually expelled. The same attitude was taken to the Americas when these conquistadors settled in the New World and subjected the Native Americans to incredible suffering. So much so that a certain Dominican monk called Bartolomé de las Casas observed this and wrote about it in a book called A Brief History of the Indies. And you can find that book on Audible. What he wrote really surprised, was really shocking because it read like a history of genocide. And at the time, the kings in those days saw themselves as people with divine rights whose key mandate was to bring people into the church. And so when they read about the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas, they called the Council of the Indies in Valladolid to try to address this particular issue. And when they were talking about the treatment of these Native Americans, the key contention was around this particular point. Do these Native Americans have souls? Can they be considered as human in the eyes of God? After much back and forth between Bartolomé de las Casas and people like Oviedo, they eventually decided that these Native Americans were human, albeit humans of a lesser kind. But that was enough for Bartolomé de las Casas to encourage these conquistadors to stop their near decimation of the Native American tribes. But what Bartolomé de las Casas also did was that he advised them to look to Africa as a way of making up the labor shortfall. Now, by this point in history, certain ideas around the beastly, animalistic nature and intellectual inferiority of certain peoples, people from Africa, people from Asia, even the Irish, had already entered into academics and philosophical circles. And those discussions to create a sort of hierarchy of humans started. And it is at this point that this religious form of racism mutated into scientific racism. One of the most important texts of that time is a book called Crania Americana by a man called Samuel George Morton, who looked at the skulls of particular people and tried to create a hierarchy based on cranium size. This particular belief came in handy because it enabled otherwise decent people to engage in 400 years of what we now call the transatlantic slave trade. It would be 300 years into that trade before this behavior and this belief would be challenged by the abolitionist movement. It would be yet another 110 years before the world would get to see where this all leads in the Holocaust. And in 1950, UNESCO, after meeting with a number of geneticists and anthropologists, came to the conclusion that race is not a genuine biological category. We have since had other findings from the Human Genome Project of 2003 that shows that there is more genetic variation within continents than there is between continents, again highlighting the insignificance of race. The 60s, 70s, and 80s saw a period of social changes, civil rights campaigns. Many of the laws that were brought in to stop discrimination on the basis of race were brought in around that time. And at this point, racism mutated yet again. What started as religious racism, which had mutated into scientific racism, mutated yet again into cultural racism. That is more about superior cultures and less about superior people. According to the sociologist Yuri Ben Eliezer, he says that an important characteristic of the so-called new racism or cultural racism or differential racism is the fact that it essentializes ethnicity and religion and traps people into supposedly immutable reference categories as if they are incapable of adapting to a new reality or changing their identity. By these means, cultural racism treats the other culture as a threat that might contaminate the dominant culture and its internal coherence. Such a view is clearly based on the assumption that certain groups are the genuine carriers of the national culture and the exclusive heirs of their history, while others are potential slayers of its purity. I'll take you to something that happened at the start of 2021 in America. You had a group of people who, inspired by their idol Donald Trump, stormed Capitol Hill, and we all know what happened afterwards. A man who had an area of specialism in looking at uprisings around the world studied the profile of those people, and his findings were quite surprising. He found that most of those people were not from the red states in America, they were from the blue states. Less than 7% of them were unemployed. Very few of them had direct links with groups like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters. What they all had in common was a belief in something called the Great Replacement Theory, which is an anti-Semitic theory, which is really about the fact that the suggestion that with the help of liberals, the rights of the minority will eventually trump the rights of the majority. So there's nothing else we get from this slide. It's just this idea that we know from history that racism mutates into socially acceptable forms. This timeline contains within it a reservoir of all kinds of racist ideas, many of which still filter through in common discourse today. And so what we want to do as people who are active anti-racist is develop the ability to understand some of these ideas and to be able to challenge them whenever we hear them. Now, people may say, well, all of this is history now. Surely nobody still holds these views in 2023. Well, think again, because in 2019, Nuffield College published the results of some experiments that they've been doing. These are not surveys, they're experiments. And what they did was they put a number of ideas to the British public and got their views and recorded those. And one of the questions that they put was an overtly racist question. Some races or ethnic groups are born less intelligent than others. And when this was done initially, about 18% of the British public agreed. And when it was repeated in 2019, 19% of the public agreed. Now, I was surprised by that because for me, that was quite a significant minority, 1 in every 5. But the researchers suggested that the reason the number wasn't higher was because of political correctness. And so they decided to word the question a little more subtly. Some races or ethnic groups are born harder working than others. And to that, a substantially larger percentage, 44% said yes when it was done initially, 38% when it was done recently. So you can see there just how an idea which comes from that era that I described still filters through today. And the work of anti-racism is the work of reading and understanding and being able to challenge where we hear those views expressed. Now, what I've just been talking about has been quite heavy. So I'm going to ask you a question, and this is based on a TV program. So I'd like to ask the question, if I use a certain expression, and I'm going to give you a clue, it's from a BBC program, right? If I use the expression, Mother of God, Would anyone know what BBC program I am referring to? It's a 6-part series. I think I've given enough clues, but just in case, if I use the expression "Mother of God," well done, Ellen. That's it. Line of Duty. Now, question for you. How many people watched Line of Duty? You can tell me by emoji. Fantastic. I can see that. I can see quite a few people there. How many people were disappointed by the end of Line of Duty? I can see a few more thumbs up. How many people would like to have words with Jed Mercurio, who wrote Line of Duty, about the end? Oh, didn't watch. Very wise, Michael. Well, for those who don't know about Line of Duty, it's a long series, and it's to do with the police, and it was to do with corrupt practices in the police. And we effectively went through 6 seasons of trying to trace the the bad actors, if you like, within the police. And the sort of this was all of those corrupt practices were spearheaded by somebody who was mysteriously referred to as H. And so we spent 6 seasons trying to find out who H was. Eventually, when we found out who it was, we were so unimpressed because he was just like the least impressive and least intelligent kind of person. Now, and a lot of people were really disappointed with that. Now, I'm about to show you that Jed Mercurio is a genius. And you know why he was a genius? Because by ensuring that this person we were all waiting for was somebody that was so unimpressive, what he was trying to tell us was actually the individual does not matter. What matters is the culture within a place. And the same thing is true when we look at this issue around racism. Now, racism can operate at different levels. You can have systemic racism, which is just ongoing racial inequalities maintained by society in housing and banking, education, in health, in the criminal justice system. You can have you can have racism that is institutional. And I remember being in a room just in Croydon about a year ago, and I was told that Baroness Doreen Lawrence was going to be a same table. And so I had to ask her the question, as somebody who has worked so hard since the tragic death of her son. I asked, do you think that we are much further forward, or have we just found ways of sort of maintaining the same thing? And she paused for a moment, and then she said to me, she says, I don't think we're that far forward. I think we've just found new ways of doing the same thing. Now, that was before I sort of knew about the report that Baroness Casey would then publish around the Metropolitan Police. But it's hard when you read the findings of Baroness Casey's report. It's very hard to disagree with Baroness Doreen Lawrence's assessment. Quite often, institutional practices are less about racist people and more about policy. You can have interpersonal racism, and that's quite a common one that most people know about, and that's what you would often hear spoken about. But the one that we talk about the least is internalized racism, because the ultimate aim of the racist isn't just to hurt another person's feelings, is to get that person to believe in their own inferiority. And, it's the reason why the skin bleaching industry is a billion-dollar industry, because people have been sort of conditioned to think of beauty in terms of its proximity to whiteness. And Yale did a doll experiment in which these young people consistently all felt that the Barbie doll was the one that was pretty. But if I could summarize what it feels like to the person that experiences it, it'd be the word denial. As someone said, denial is the heartbeat of racism. And so you can have the denial of dignity. I remember speaking to a white mother of a mixed race child who spoke about her son walking with his friends who all happened to be white. They're stopped by police, and he's the only one who's singled out to be searched. They found nothing, and they went ahead and carried on their journey. But I want you to just think with me in the mind of this young boy who maybe for the first time has been made to realize that he is different from his friends. I want to think about the impact of repeated experiences like that. Statistically, that boy is 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. What impact does that have? We can read about the Windrush generation, and there's a great book by Amelia Gentleman called The Windrush Betrayal, and I'd recommend everyone read that book. In his 1952 classic, The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison begins with a monologue. I am invisible, he says, not a spook like that which haunted Edgar Allan Poe. I am not like one of your movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, of liquid and fiber, and I can even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows, it's as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard distorting glass. When they approach me, they see my surroundings, they see themselves, they see figments of their imagination, indeed anything and everything except me. And in many ways, for a lot of people, that is what racism feels like today. And so when the young Nigerian student, medical student, Chidebere Ibe, did something that came naturally to him, he drew a portrait of a black fetus and he posted it online and went viral because most people had never seen one before. Chidebere then went on to say that if every time people are trained in medicine, if they are not seeing those examples, it's perhaps not a wonder that when they are faced with the people, that they are not treated with the same level of empathy. Statistically, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. You can have a denial of presence in the way we talk about history. We talk about the wars, but don't emphasize the role that people from the Caribbean, from Africa, also played in those wars. Or it can happen just in everyday conversation, in persistently not giving someone your attention, not talking over them, not giving them eye contact, not saying their name correctly. And these are things that happen on a daily basis. What can you do as an ally to ensure that when a person's presence is being denied, that you are the first to acknowledge it? You can have the denial of opportunity, such as the Nuffield Center for Social Investigations experiment, in which they created 3,200 fictitious CVs and sent those out in response to actual jobs. And when the results came back, it became obvious that you could have a person, same qualifications, but with a Nigerian sounding name, and the team would have to send out 80% more applications in order to get a similar callback rate to somebody, same qualifications, but with a white sounding name. And the results of this were published just in 2019. The denial of opportunity. You could have the denial of agency. Like a few years ago, Rachel Riley, the Countdown host, decided to took some time off maternity leave, and she was replaced by this woman, and Twitter and social media went apoplectic because they said this was just diversity gone wrong or gone too far. And what they didn't realize is that this woman, Anne Mafidon, comes from one of the families that has often been said to be one of the most intelligent families in the UK. She was one of the youngest at the time to get into Oxford to study computing and mathematics, and was more than qualified to do that job. Some of the most hurtful experiences your colleagues will have will be when their experiences are denied, a thing we refer to as gaslighting. And the question I often ask is, if every time you hear an account of racism, if your first instinct is to question the veracity of the account, rather than to err on the side of caution, we should ask ourselves why that is. There is the good-bad binary, where a person would assume that if a person is nice, they can't also be racist. It's the logic that says racism is bad, bad people are racist, I am not bad, so I can't be racist. I mentioned in the presentation earlier that there was a book called Crania Americana that was one of the most important scientifically racist texts. And the group that bought that book the most were the abolitionists. The abolitionists at the time had this argument that when there was this discussion around racism, their argument was that these slaves are not as intelligent, and so the slave owners had nothing to fear. So these are the kind of things that we often deal with. And then, of course, there's the denial of second chances. We often assume that if there is an obvious reason, sorry, just a second. We often assume that if there is an obvious reason for the hostility to which a person is being subjected, that racism is absent. But the question we must ask is, does the punishment fit the crime? And of course, there is the denial of profit for those, because ultimately this is self-defeating. So that's the problem. What do we do about it? Well, what we do is we go on the allyship journey. An ally stands alongside the underrepresented and supports their cause because of the impact to the people affected. And they define an attribute is empathy. I particularly like this quote from Brené Brown, where she says, empathy is not so much connecting to an experience, but connecting with the emotions that underpin that experience. It's not saying I fully understand what you're going through. It's saying that I don't fully understand it because I have no experience of it, but I'm going to stand by you because it's important to you. And this is what it looks like. It looks like starting from a place of apathy, which is where most people are, to a place of developing empathy. The truth is, for most of us, we grew up in homes where 99% of the people who walk through your door are people who are like you. And because of that, it can be very difficult to develop real empathy. And so it's about understanding our own triggers and biases, because we all have them. And it's also about understanding this idea of unearned privilege, becoming active and embedding ourselves in communities that are different, and then becoming advocates. That's what it looks like on an individual basis. What about as organizations? Well, what we need is a plan for racial equity. It's about, and these images actually just illustrate that very well. For most organizations, the first image is what they do. We're an equal opportunities employer. So if we're running internships, for example, so that people who don't have the opportunity may have those opportunities, we give exactly the same opportunity to everyone, completely ignoring what barriers may exist. So we'll run an event that is about STEM education, and we'll assume everyone has a laptop, for example, without thinking about those particular barriers that may stop people from having genuine equality of opportunity. The equity model thinks about those barriers and tries to address them. And where we hope to get to is a point where those barriers are removed and we can all enjoy the game. As someone said, equality is like giving everyone a shoe. Equity is like giving everyone a shoe that fits. And this is what it looks like. It's about widening your own circles to say, who is different from me in my world? It's about thinking about, joining your culture ambassador network that the IMechE is putting up. AFB is excited to be partnering with the IMechE on the mentoring program or the Making Engineering Hot program. Could you put yourself up as a STEM ambassador to support that, or maybe put yourself as somebody to be reverse mentored by somebody who is younger? You can have a chat. The IMechE is blessed in many ways with great champions like Alice Bunn, like Isabel Polikoff, like Christina, like Giles, and other people, other keen diversity champions at the IMechE. Could you have a chat with them and just in that process work to just increase and expand your knowledge? Could you look up some of the resources like the IMechE allyship fact sheet that has been put together, or maybe just start to think of what you watch on things like Netflix. There's an interesting thing with algorithms that sometimes when you start to watch, you find out what your colleagues, maybe who are different from you, watch, and more suggestions come up as a result. You can start to recognize diversity as a competency when you're looking at overall performance and start to pay your ethnic and female employees the same amount for the same job. And these are some of the things that we can do individually. There was a video here about the ethnicity index, which I won't go into, but I'd encourage everyone to look it up. Nope. I did not want to play the video. Sorry, just a second. I will just stop that. Yeah, we're coming to the to the end of this now. And so the question is, which zone are you? Most people are in the fear zone. These are quite difficult subjects, and we strive to be comfortable. The ally will move beyond that into the learning zone, where they recognize racism as a problem, they seek out questions that make them uncomfortable, and they understand their privilege. And growth is where we start to identify how we may unknowingly benefit from racism and promote and advocate policies and leaders that are anti-racist, and we lean into the discomfort. So the question I'm leaving you with is this: what do you consider to be your blind spot? Because we all have them. So what I've tried to do today is define racism, particularly through the lens of history. We talked about what it looks like today, and then we tried to talk about solutions, what we do as individuals and what we do as organizations. And all of this is so that, as Alice mentioned at the start, we have so many problems. You've got the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that are there to address these issues. The only way to ensure that we get to those solutions is that we are truly widening participation to every voice. And, you know, on the back of that, we get real solutions. In the words of Octavia Butler, she says, there is nothing new under the sun, but there are other suns. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ollie. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
That was really, really interesting. Well, I've learned a lot myself. I hope, yeah, I see some thank yous are coming through the chat function. Please post your questions in the chat function for Ollie and us for IMechE. Really happy to answer those. But whilst we are waiting for some questions to come through and see if anyone wants to learn something different from this session, I wanted to ask, like, we are trying to promote allyship at the IMechE as much as we can. We've actually created a fact sheet on how to become a good ally, and because we know it is so hard sometimes to start. You may have the best intentions, but you don't know where do we start, actually, you know? So I'm going to drop that in the chat function for anyone who'd like to have a look. And we've got many other fact sheets, inclusion moments to ensure we're creating that inclusive, safe space, safe culture, the institution, you know, and inclusion being one of our core values and part of our high-level strategy. I'm interested to hear any specific example from you, Ollie, around allyship that you've seen in other companies or individuals, something that we could learn from those examples. Do you have anything you could share with us?
Oh, that's a great question. I was recently at an event. It was a nice sort of event at the art gallery here in Aberdeen. And I was talking to people, and every now and then I get introduced to people about, you know, they say, oh, Ollie gets involved in the AFBE. And my tendency is to assume that people may not necessarily always be interested in it. So when he was asking, when this gentleman was asking me about what I do, my initial thought was to give him the, you know, sort of shorter version. And then he said to me, he said, oh, it says, I used to work at a certain company, and I created the ethnicity network there. I thought, oh, because as far as I could see, he was a white man who was talking to me. He then told me that actually he comes from a family. His family were refugees. And he said that one day when he was having a chat with a black colleague at work who was talking about the issues that he faced, he said he suddenly, something inside him, because of his own background, connected. And it was really that led him, alongside this man, to create this network. And actually, that network has some of the best, the most sort of transparent and the most sort of effective programs that I've seen anywhere. And it was all created through empathy. And this is the thing about allyship. We often present allyship almost as in the same way that we talk about giving to people who are far away, like a charity thing. But actually, the reason why allyship is important is because it's in all of our interests. And it's that point at which some of the suffering and the challenges faced by those people who are underrepresented overlap with our own challenges. That is really the real basis of allyship. And so that was a great example of a person hearing about the issue, but connecting with it in his own way. Because the truth is, there are many things that I've talked about today that will be experienced by many of our female colleagues. You know, you want to talk about the denial of presence, many of them know exactly what that's like. They know what it's like to be in a room and for people to assume that you're not the CEO or the manager just because you're on. Well, there is that point of connection, and you could take any group, whether it's people from a lower social class, whether it's, you know, and you can identify those areas of overlap, and that's how we build empathy. And that for me is one of the most important ways in which I've tried to understand allyship.
That's a great example. Thanks so much, Ollie, for sharing. I think for me, there is an element of, you know, giving back to the community, to the society, and it makes you feel so fulfilled and motivated. It's when you can share your experience and be, you know, like, you know, the mentoring program is kind of a good example as well that you're running, you know, being someone who could give a hand to someone else to uplift them, to energize them, to support them in their journey and connecting to what they're experiencing. I think it is so fulfilling for all of us. It is what makes us tick and really uplifts us as individuals. And I think the moment we try it, it's hard not to keep engaging. That's definitely my experience.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I've seen quite a few questions coming up through the chat, so I'm trying to read through them. Lots of thank yous to Ollie. Very insightful webinar. The recording will the recording of this webinar become available? Yes, it will become available. Probably next week we will share with everyone. A question from Rob. Do you have any suggestions for how we at the IMechE can secure a greater proportion of BME speakers and panelists at our technical events? Great question.
I love that question because to me, it's the essence of diversity. I remember being in an interview once talking about the energy industry and somebody sending me a message saying, it's so nice to hear you talk about something that's not about diversity and inclusion. And I thought, absolutely, because, you know, within our group, within our number, there are many. And I think what we can do is we can continue to create the space. So when you look at your membership, within your membership, there's no doubt that there are people who are talented in, you know, all of the different areas, whether it's the built environment, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's the energy supply or the energy transition. There are so many people from various groups. Can we start to maybe just have a check? Like these days, when I see all male panels, there's part of me just thinks, could they really not find somebody who was, a female engineer to be on this panel? And I think if we get used to the idea that whenever we're talking about any topic, we just embed this idea that we should also, in addition, be trying to understand people have, what they can bring to the conversation, so that you're not just inviting them because they happen to be from a minoritized group, because they're a specialist in their subject. So but yeah, I think because we've become so accustomed to just going to the same, That's the only reason we end up with what I might call all we need to do is just have that intention and you know, have a sense when you're looking at the diversity of your members to kind of think about what their areas of specialization is, and see how you can just engage them more in the conversation. And yeah, let's all start to get a little bit uncomfortable and uneasy when we see panels that are just always all male. What's going on there? Are you telling me you can find a specialist who's female who could also be part of this panel? So yeah, let's turn that into a habit, something that comes second nature to us, that we ask that question.
Thank you. Yes, and we are working with AFBE-UK to ensure we are sourcing diverse speakers for our events, and with all of our partners specifically. It's something we're really working hard on. Thank you. I've seen a few more guests have joined us. Unfortunately, we're just at the end of our webinar, but this is a recorded webinar, so you will receive the recording later next week. We've also received a few more comments from Alice, some very positive comments and thank yous from the audience in general. I think we're at 1 o'clock and we're coming to a close. I'll give a couple more minutes to the audience to post any last minute questions in the chat function, but I know we've hosted a similar session a few years ago internally for our employees. It's been so eye-opening, and it sparks a lot of reflections, and sometimes those questions, you know, you have to process that information, and then you've got the questions coming up, so sometimes it's really hard on the spot. So I appreciate I'm putting you all on the spot here, the audience. But I'm hugely grateful to you, Ollie. Thank you so much for taking the time. You know, we're so grateful to be partnering with you, with AFBE-UK, and we've got some great plans ahead on how we can together make an impact, a positive impact for our communities, for our engineers and employees. And yes, I think we will end it there today. Thank you so much all. Thank you, our audience, and thank you, Alice, for the introduction and for the welcoming. Thanks, Isabel. Isabel is our D&I chair and nominations committee chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, if anyone's got any more questions that they want to ask, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to pick up on questions that people have. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure I know somebody who does.
Definitely. Lots of thank yous coming in through the chat.
Oh, fantastic.
I think we can end it there, Ollie. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye for now.
Thanks all, and have a good rest of your afternoon.